Hi everyone and welcome back to Knit Cat Paddywhack. I'm Kat and I share easy knitting tutorials for new knitters or if you just want something fun and quick to knit. If this interests you, please consider subscribing to this channel. As I announced in my last video, I am pregnant with my second child. I already have a 2.5-year-old daughter and this baby is due in August. I'm going to make this baby a blanket and I thought it would be fun to share with you the pattern week by week. And today I'm going to be sharing the first square with you, which is really a rectangle as you can see. But it's this simple Intarsia heart. I'll be posting the free pattern for this on my blog, which I will link in the description below. If you'd like to make this little heart with me, keep watching. First of all, let me apologise for the weird noises you might be hearing in the background. It's super windy today. Before we start knitting, let me just explain a few things about this project. Here's a picture of the design, roughly. The picture squares are all knit in Intarsia, which is a type of colour knitting. It is also sometimes called picture knitting. If you're new to Intarsia, it's a lot of fun. I think it's probably my second favourite technique after lace. And as we go along, I'll share more details and tips about the technique. All the picture squares are knit in stocking or stockinette stitch. The solid colour squares are going to be different stitch patterns, which will add some texture and a little bit of a challenge for newer knitters. The yarn I'm using is this one. It's called Gradients by Value Ball, and it comes in tubes of 5 different colours. Each tube contains 5 balls, which are 50 grams each, and I bought 5 tubes in total, so that adds up to a kilogram of yarn total. So this Value Ball brand is a super budget friendly yarn that's available at Spotlight, which is a large craft chain that's in Australasia. And I chose this yarn because it's machine washable, it's surprisingly soft, and of course it was on clearance for $5 for the ball, so $1 a ball. I thought that was pretty good. And I chose this set of 5 neutral colours because I'm really liking that palette at the moment. And we also don't know if we're having a boy or a girl, but feel free to get creative with the colours you choose. The yarn weight, I would say, is a 10 ply or a worsted weight. And your tension or gauge for this project is 19 stitches and 26 rows in stocking stitch using 4mm needles. And by the way, if you're hearing these words like tension, gauge, stocking stitch, yarn weight, and you have no idea what I'm talking about, don't worry. I'll find videos explaining as many of these concepts as I can, and I'll put them in the description below so you don't get lost. The blanket itself, as you can see, is rectangular and it's going to be about 74 centimetres by 102 centimetres. And I think that could be classed as a pram blanket kind of size. And as you can see, the background colour for all the picture rectangles is the lightest shade, which I've called colour 1. That's this creamy coloured shade. And the contrast colour for each of the rows starts with the darkest shade in the top row going down to the lightest shade in the bottom. And the texture squares in between are going to be primarily the same contrast colour per row, although some of them I'll do 2 colour stitch patterns just to add a little bit of interest. Also to note is that I'm Australian, as you might have noticed, and I tend to use UK terminology rather than US. So I say things like stocking stitch rather than stockinette stitch, and I say tension, not gauge, and I also use metric measurements most of the time. And again, I'll try to find a link to some translations between US and UK knitting terminology so you don't get lost. Okay, so I think that's all the housekeeping before we get started, so let's get into it. So when we do Intarsia, typically we're going to read from a chart. So if you haven't read from a knitting chart before, Or just hopefully you'll be able to see close up. So the rows up are vertical and the stitches are horizontal, and we read, because this is a back and forth project, we start reading from the right hand side for row 1, and then when we get to row 2 we're reading from the left hand side, and we go sort of zigzag all the way up. And as you can see here, so this white bit is the lightest shade that I have, and the heart is going to be in colour 5, which is the darkest shade. So the needles that we're using are 4mm straight needles. Other things you'll need for this project are a darning needle or a tapestry needle, some scissors, a tape measure or a ruler, this is my gauge as well, and a row counter is really handy as well. So as we can see from the chart, the first 12 rows are just knit in colour 1 straight. So we're going to take our colour 1 and cast on 32 stitches, and all of these picture rectangles will be 32 stitches by 62 rows. So I made them roughly the dimensions of an A4 piece of paper, and I'm hoping the blanket will come out as those dimensions as well, with a little bit of edging. And I'm using the long tail cast on here, but you can use whatever cast on you're comfortable with. So I've cast on my 32 stitches, and now, as we can see from the chart, we're just going to knit 12 rows in stocking stitch. Stocking stitch means that for all of the odd numbered rows we knit every stitch, and for all of the even numbered rows we purl every stitch. If you're wondering why I keep my row counter on a string, it's because I like to wear it around my neck. So I'm back. I've done my 12 rows in just the colour 1 in stocking stitch, and now so we're up to row 13 here. Row 13, and we're starting with the colour work. So a feature of Intarsia knitting which is different to stranded colour work, which is a different kind of colour knitting, is that when you change colours, you change to a whole new ball of yarn. You don't carry the first yarn behind the work. You just start a new one. So this bit of colour one is one ball, this bit of brown is another ball, and this bit of colour one is a third ball. And you can carry the yarn up. So we have our 3 balls of yarn, and they all come with us as we travel. And when we get to this bit here, we will go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 balls of yarn if we're doing Intarsia all by the book. Occasionally, if I have a very small section with just like 2 or 3 stitches, I might carry the previous ball over, but that's technically not correct Intarsia. So when you have a small patch of one colour, you can just use a whole big ball of yarn if you want, but to make it a little bit more manageable, you can use either just a long strand of yarn and just have it loose. You can roll yourself a small centre pull ball, or you can do something called making a butterfly, which is basically making a small centre pull ball, but it's a special kind, and I thought I would show you how to do that for our colour 5 here. So we have our length of yarn, grab a few fingers and wrap it around. Because there's a fair bit of a patch here that's one colour, and I'll do a fairly big butterfly, but you could do quite small ones as well. It just helps you manage the yarn. Okay, so once you've done a fair bit around your fingers, you grab your scissors cut a length. I'll do a fairly long length because I want to have enough yarn, hopefully, to finish the whole heart without starting again. And just around this bit that you've looped around your fingers, you just fairly loosely wrap that last tail that you just cut around the centre. When you get to the end, you just tuck underneath to secure it. So what that means is you knit from this end and it comes out of the loop. So it's basically like a really loose centre pull ball, and that's what we'll be using. And for the 2 cream colours, I'm just going to use 2 balls of yarn. If I were to be taking this somewhere, going on the bus or something, I might roll small balls or make butterflies for all of the colours, but since I'm just sitting at home, I can have the luxury of using 2 full balls in that cream colour. So let's take a look at our chart again. You can see that we're going, the first 15 stitches are in colour 1, the cream colour, and then stitch 16 and 17 are in colour 5, and then the rest of the stitches in the row are in colour 1. Now I'm up to stitch 16, so I'll grab my colour 5 yarn and knit 6 stitches. And for joining yarn, just simply knit the next stitch in that colour, because if you're going to be knitting 2 stitches together to join the yarn, then it will show through. So we've just got 2 loose stitches here, and when we're finished we'll weave this one in and we won't be able to notice the join. So I've done my 2 stitches in colour 5, and then I'll join on my new ball of colour 1. Again, simply just start knitting with it loose. That's what I do, and knit to the end. Now on row 14, we're starting at row 14 from the left hand side because it's a wrong side row, and as we go along we see that it's the same 2 stitches that we're knitting in the colour 5, so that's stitch 17 and 16. Now we're up to the changing colours, up to colour 5, so this bit is quite important with Intarsia knitting. So we're taking our colour 1, so that's the previous yarn that we were using, and we're going to lay it over the yarn that we're about to pick up, such that they sort of weave around each other, because that locks it all together and it means that we don't have big gaps between stitches. So let's knit these 2 stitches. And again, as we change back to colour 1, we pick up the tail that was left behind when we finished up on row 12. We pick that up underneath the colour 5 so that they're looped around each other, like how we did when we changed colours before, and we knit to the end. But just before I get to the end, because this is just the start of adding a new ball, you can see it can be a little bit loose there, so I'm just going to tighten it up a little bit just to make sure that our tension when we're finished will be nice and even. You can see on the other side there that it's fairly even now. Row 15 now, and you can see that we are adding 1 extra stitch on either side for the colour 5, and that's really simple to do. Basically follow the same procedure as what we've been doing before, but I'll show you how to do it just for this row. Okay, so we're up to where we need to be knitting a colour 5. So again, we lay the previous yarn colour over the yarn that we're about to pick up. So I'll just turn it over so you can see what I'm doing. So I'm laying this one over and then picking up colour 5 so it comes up underneath it so they're entwined. And then I'll just knit these 4 stitches in colour 5. And then again change colours. So I'll pick up the yarn tail that was left behind, pass my colour 5 over the top of the new yarn so it's all locked together, and then keep on knitting. So that's the basics of Intarsia for a nice simple Intarsia pattern like this with just one block colour. And it's all pretty straightforward up until we get to this little curve in the heart here. So I will knit up to row 45 off camera, and then I'll see you when we get to row 46 so we can see what we do when we get to this section here. So I'm back. I have just finished working row 45, and you can see that I am up to just here where we get the 2 little top bits of the heart. So I've just worked a right side row, about to work row 46, which is wrong side. As you can see here, I did actually run out of yarn in my colour 5, so I'm about to run out of my second butterfly as well. It's not a butterfly anymore even. So I wanted to film this bit because if you're new to Intarsia, it's just a good example of how sometimes you end up juggling lots of different little balls of yarn at once. So because we've got these sorts of 5 different sections of colour, we have 1, 2, 3 of colour 1 and 1, 2 of colour 5, we need a separate ball of yarn for each section. So that's 5 balls of yarn, and like I said, you could do that as a full ball of yarn, a small ball, a butterfly, or just a float. I'm doing a bit of a combination. So what I've done just to make it easier for me is I've turned one of my balls of the colour 1 yarn into a butterfly, and so that is this side, because when I finish the colour 5, which is row 50, I'll be over here. So I've kept a full ball on this side here, so this is attached to a full ball of yarn. So once I've done with all the colour 5 stuff, I can just carry on with the full ball up to the top. And I've got a butterfly for this section here for when this bit is finished. I've got a butterfly for this section here, this side, and I have a small butterfly for this little colour 1 triangle here. So let's get started. Okay, so moving on to my first section of colour 5, so I'm starting here. So I've worked this row here, the first section of colour 5. Now I need to attach my new little ball of colour 1, and just doing 2 stitches for this little bit for now. And then once I've worked those 2 stitches, I grab my new butterfly for colour 5 and join that one on. And remembering that where we've joined all of these new bits of yarn, there will be a gap, and when we weave in ends we just need to be mindful that we close that gap. Okay, moving on to the last section, which is another colour 1. Remembering to pass the previous yarn over the top of the new one so they weave around each other. And just working this one to the end. And as you can see, this is the wrong side. Once we've woven in all the ends, we'll have a really neat, kind of almost looks like a stitched edging around here, which is different to other kinds of colour work, like stranded knitting, which will give you floats, so like threads, horizontal threads going all along, which looks nice as well and creates a thicker fabric. But this makes quite a nice neat fabric, and I thought, as well as me just liking Intarsia, this would be quite good for a baby's blanket. It makes it not so heavy, but it also means there aren't little bits of yarn that could be pulled up by little fingers and potentially trap little fingers. So we're on to row 47 now, and we're just continuing as we have been. So when we get to the colour 5 bit, we start using our first section of colour 5. This little triangle of colour 1 we just carry up from the 2 stitches that we worked here up to the top, and then once we get to the end of row 50, we're just working colour 1 all the way up to the end of row 62. Now I've just finished working row 50, which is the last row that has any colour 5 on it. So the heart is now finished. All that's left to do is to knit 12 rows in colour 1, which is that cream colour. So what I'm going to do, just so that I don't have all these annoying strands in my way when they don't need to be there, is I'm going to cut all of them except for the yarn that I'm going to be working with, which is this one, which is attached to my full ball of yarn. That's why I kept the full ball attached to one of the colour 1 sections. So I'll just cut these short. We can use these butterflies for another square. Obviously cut them long enough so that you can weave them in at the end, but not so long that they'll be in your way. Okay, now I will just be working my 12 rows in colour 1, and then I'll cast off. Use whichever method of casting off you prefer. I've finished knitting my rectangle and now I'm just going to cast off. I'm doing a pretty basic cast off here where I will knit a stitch and then pass the previous stitch over it up to the end. One thing to note when you're doing the cast off is to make sure it's loose enough that it doesn't gather up the top of the rectangle, so that it's about as loose as your cast on, whatever cast on you chose. Finish off your rectangle by weaving in your ends. Intarsia always has a lot of ends to weave in. And just make sure you do it as neatly as you can. Where you weave in ends where there's a change in colour, make sure you are closing any holes that might be there. Here's a good example. So I've got a little gap here and my tail here. So just close the gap just with one stitch, taking the colour 1 over one stitch over into the colour 5. If you take it too far in, you might have the colour 1 show through on the front, which you don't want. And then just where you can, weave in using colour 1 stitches. So again, if any of this weaving in shows through, that it's showing through the same colour as what's on the front. And just check as you go along that the front is nice and neat. I'm pretty happy with that bit. And make sure that your ends are as secure as they can be, so you don't have the little tails coming through the front if they start to unravel a little bit. You can finish off your piece by blocking it. This will make it a lot easier to seam up at the end. I'm going to steam block this rectangle, as I found that acrylic yarns hold a steam block pretty well. If you don't know about methods for finishing your knitting projects, I'll find some tutorials and post them in the description below. You can of course block your rectangles after you've knitted all of them, but I wanted to do this one so you could see what the finished product looks like. And there you have it, our first square or rectangle really of this baby blanket. I hope you've enjoyed following along. Remember that you can get the free pattern for this rectangle on my blog, which I will link below. If you'd like to continue following along with this knit along project, don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you get notified when I post a new video. I'm really looking forward to working on this blanket together. Happy knitting. Bye.